Hello, everyone. What we're going to be learning about today is epic characteristics. So we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation. So epic characteristics, you'll be surprised about how familiar you are with them. So for instance, we see a lot of these in all of our favorite movies and especially big series. So things like Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, almost all Marvel movies, Narnia, Star Wars, a lot of Disney movies all have the same thing, which are epic characteristics, which are based off of this thing called an epic poem, which we see in what we're about to read, which is the Odyssey. So what is an epic? Originally, it was a long poem telling the deeds and adventures of heroic or legendary figures or the history of a nation. Epic poems are really, really long. The Iliad is 15,693 lines, and the Odyssey is 12,110 lines. So those are super long poems. So epic refers to a genre of literature or movies that have certain characteristics. It is a grand and sweeping story told on a large, large scale. So here's a quick overview of the epic characteristics. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because we break it down one by one and go over some examples that you might be familiar with. So for instance, we're going to really look at epic characteristics as seen in film because that's probably where you guys have seen it the most. We're going to look at these characteristics more closely with some film examples. Remember, these are characteristics that applied originally to ancient poetry. Not all epic movies or books have every single one of these epic characteristics. Some movies may only have a few, some may have most of them. So the first one is called invocation. It's when the story opens with the storyteller asking for help or guidance from a god or spirit or other inspiration. We'll look at this more closely in the Odyssey, but it is often absent from modern epics. Typically, a lot of epic poems, or even just Greek literature and drama to begin with, starts with them calling on the muses to help guide them to tell them this story, or calling on Zeus or Athena or any of the gods or goddesses to help them make sure they tell this story well. The next one is in medias res, which is Latin for into the middle of things. Epic stories often begin somewhere in the middle, usually at some crucial point in the action. When the story begins, important events that the audience needs to know have already taken place, so flashbacks and extensive exposition are used. We see this a lot in our modern movies. For instance, in Harry Potter, Harry's parents have already been killed by Lord Voldemort, and he was the boy who lived. He survived Voldemort's attack and defeated Voldemort, or so it seemed. So they've already started a main action has already happened. So they're starting in the middle of things. Same thing with all of the Star Wars movies. You know how all the Star Wars movies begin with that scrolling screen letting us know what's happened, Civil War has happened. It's giving us all this exposition. So flashback means by which authors present material that occurred early in the present tense of the narrative, usually through characters' memories, dreams, or accounts of past events. Exposition is writing or speech that explains a process or presents information. So we see flashbacks, especially in Harry Potter, when Harry learns about what truly happened to him before he was placed at the Dursleys, and we see exposition in things such as Star Wars. Next is good versus evil. The primary conflict in an epic is good against evil. Good and those who support them will likely win. So we see this in almost any movie we watch today. There's always some good protagonist. The good hero has to defeat some evil being or government or power in order to triumph and win the day. So, I mean, once again, Harry Potter is a great example with this. Harry versus Voldemort, Katniss versus Snow and the government of the Capitol, Iron Man and Thanos. But some things to think about is, how do we define good and how do we define evil? Are these definitions fixed or do they change over time? I mean, some people could argue that even though Thanos goes about his mission in an evil way, his main his main goal, which is to save the environment, to save the destruction of a planet or Earth, was a good goal, but he went about it the wrong way by trying to destroy half of every planet's population. So I think in a lot of modern movies, sometimes they play around with the definition of good and the definition of evil. We definitely have some uh, characters that are technically the protagonist, but they go about things in not necessarily the smartest way, or they're like the anti-hero. Um, so we still root for them, even though they're probably not doing everything in kind of the good and great um, moral way. Next is the fate of nation or people. So the concerns in an epic are big. The fate of a people or nation is at risk. Another way to think of it is not necessarily a people or a nation. It could be a city, a planet, a world, or a galaxy, or a universe. So we see this all the time in superhero movies. Spider-Man, it's the city of New York. Black Panther, it's Wakanda. In Guardians of the Galaxy, it's the galaxy. So you see this all the time in superhero movies. And in most epics, there are a certain people who are at risk, or a nation. Battle scenes. So in epic stories often include extensive and large-scale battle scenes. So, for instance, Wonder Woman, the No Man's Land scene, where it's big, it's in slow-mo. She's defeating all the Germans with her shield and getting through No Man's Land and leading her team to victory. We see this a lot in the middle picture. That's from Lord of the Rings. There's Lord of the Rings is chock full of huge battles with lots that take what seem like 20 minutes to conclude. They're very long and very, very large scale. Same thing with all the Avengers movies, especially the last two. We see these huge, extensive, large scale battle scenes that last 20 to 30 minutes. So this is definitely something that modern movies have really, really embraced, is large, extensive battle scenes. Next is vast settings. The setting is vast, crossing large areas of land, sea, or outer space. So if the protagonist travels a lot and goes from one place to another and sees all these different settings, then they have experienced vast settings. If you think of Bilbo from The Hobbit, some of you guys read that in 7th grade. So he travels from the Shire all the way to the Misty Mountains, Lonely Mountain, into all these different towns and sees all these different vast settings. Tony Stark in one of the last Avenger movies, he's in outer space. He traveled great distances. All the Avengers basically do. They go from one country to the next. In Lord of the Rings, even though it's the same world as The Hobbit, they also have these vast settings. They cross these large areas of land that have different climates, different landscapes, and it's always visually stunning, and they typically go on a long journey. Next is massive quantities. In an epic, there are many things that can be counted: the number of characters, ships, settings, good guys, bad guys, etc. It really doesn't matter what, but in an epic, there is a massive amount of something, typically. So if you think, most of the examples I put here are the people who are battling. So in Avengers, there's millions, or it looks like millions, but it's probably just thousands of good guys and bad guys fighting it out for the universe. The movie Dunkirk, there's a lot of shots that have a lot of great examples of how massive the army is. And then also in Lord of the Rings, there's so many good guys versus bad guys. But if you think about different movies, there's so many different characters. The Avengers has a lot of different characters in movies where, like, mostly when it's epic movies that are set in like ancient Greece, there are a lot of ships and just a massive number of anything leads to massive quantities. Next is supernatural. This is when some form of supernatural being or power intervenes. This is often absent from some historical epic movies, such as Braveheart. Sometimes it is represented by super technology of some sort. We want to notice not only the presence of supernatural elements, but also consider how these elements impact the hero. So in Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is a wizard and he has these magical powers and he intervenes for both Bilbo and Frodo, typically more Frodo, where he uses his magic to help them, like when the eagle flies them all back to safety. Harry Potter obviously has magic to help him in his quest to defeat Voldemort. Rey has what's kind of a combination of super technology and magic with lightsabers and the Force. And we see supernatural with super technology in examples like Batman, Iron Man, things like that. So it's still supernatural because it's super technology and it's not technology that we have today or that we see on a daily basis. Movies like The Matrix also have super technology. So just think about movies where you have seen some supernatural being or great power or great technology really affects the hero in some way. Finally, there's the heroic figure. This is arguably the most important and probably what we will see in almost every epic. The protagonist is a heroic figure who solves problems in a clever and creative and clever way. So Luke from Star Wars, Katniss from Hunger Games, Miles Morales and Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse, Moana from Moana, Mulan, Captain America. These are all examples of heroic figures. So most movies nowadays do have what's somewhat of a heroic figure, especially if it's a big blockbuster. But some questions to consider are, what are the traits of a hero? Have these traits changed over time? So if you look at the first picture, that's actually right over here. This is actually a picture that represents the Odyssey, which is the epic poem you guys are going to be reading. That is not one of the first, but it is a really early example of a heroic figure. Then one that happens thousands of years later, but is also really big in the canon, is King Arthur. He is considered this great heroic figure. What traits does he have? You guys may laugh, but Shrek himself is a heroic figure. How has his traits changed versus King Arthur and Odysseus, and then Tony Stark as well? Are the characters more flawed? What are their morals? Just some things to consider as we go on. And it's also an interesting point to consider sometimes that some movies or series may have more than one heroic figure. It doesn't happen super often. Typically, the best example is Lord of the Rings, with both Frodo and Aragorn going on these heroic journeys separately, and they both have their own journey that they complete. So that is going over the epic characteristics. I hope you guys found it interesting. Now what we want you guys to do is to go onto Google Classroom and complete a form that kind of is a check-in on what you remember about this presentation when it comes to epic characteristics. So go over and do that now, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.